My name is Andy Gilman, and this is the Ojai Chautauqua. This is the first not for only for 2018, but our fifth season. Believe it or not, this is our fifth year. I think it's going well, and we think just the first of many. First 5 years of many. So what I want you to pay attention to on our website, you're going to see that in addition to this event, there's something scheduled for May, and that is on education. But we are planning a whole series of events that are particular to Ojai, similar to the tourism, but they're going to be addressing things like water, the area plan, all the issues that we're facing as a valley. So look for that coming up and working with the community, business people in the community, and also with the city. So we'll be announcing that very shortly. If you're not getting emails from us and you want to, there's email list out there, so please do write your email clearly and you'll get on our list with all of our announcements. On your chairs, you probably noticed that there's some cards and pens. So about halfway through the event, Dan and Cecile will announce this is a time for you to write down your questions, and some students will be coming around, gathering them all together, and then they'll deliver them, and your questions can hopefully be addressed. We always have too many questions, of course, and we can't get to them all, but we try. Finally, we need your support to make this happen. It continues to be something that we're working hard on, but we always need not just faces, but dollars and support, volunteering to make these things go. So with that, we'll kick it off, and I'd like to, Dan and Cecile, our moderators, and they'll take it from here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andy. And thanks so much to all of you that even though you've all been at this Chautauqua thing for 5 years now, for Cecile and me, this is our third year of having the great privilege of working with you. And we really do consider it to be a privilege to come here and join you for the type of conversation that, as I've told you before, we think ought to be taking place in a lot more communities across the country. And the example that the people of Ojai, set for the rest of us is something that's extraordinary. It's something that's exemplary. And we're very, very proud to be part of it. For our first 2 years of working with you, our focus was fairly singular. Throughout the calendar year 2016, we spent a great deal of time talking about the presidential election at each of our Chautauqua gatherings. Last year, given a new presidency, a new administration, and such a dramatically new environment in Washington, at each of our gatherings, we talked about a different aspect of those political and policy debates. But what became very clear to us, and we were reminded by our host committee, is that when we originally signed on to work with all of you, politics was only supposed to be one component of a much broader series of conversations. And there's a whole range, not just of public policy challenges, but societal and cultural challenges and opportunities that we believe really benefit from conversations like these. And so in just a minute, we'll tell you a little bit more about today's topic, beyond the silence breakers, what comes next. But before we begin that conversation, a couple of things I'd like to do is, one, while I've had the great privilege of serving as your moderator for the last several gatherings, this is the first time I'll be joined by a co-moderator. And what I'll tell you about our co-moderator, and we'll introduce our panelists in just a couple of minutes, is my co-moderator, among other things, was the Director of Public Affairs for the International Trade Division at the U.S. Department of Commerce in the Clinton administration. She was then the Associate Dean for the School of Management at Yale University, her alma mater. She served as the Deputy Mayor for the city of Los Angeles, specializing in communications and public affairs in public outreach. And more recently, she serves as my co-instructor in the class we teach together at the University of California, Berkeley, in political communications and strategy. And perhaps her most thankless role, Cecile Ablack, I'm proud to say, is my wife. Please join me in welcoming Cecile Ablack.
It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming. As you know from the publicity, which Andy has done so brilliantly, Today, we're going to discuss a topic which has really been front of center of the news, And I believe, and I don't know if you would agree with this, that we've been really sort of reading the same sort of thing over and over, which is really just sort of a rehash. What we hope to do here this evening, and what we encourage you to do in the questions you ask, is really think through, okay, at this pivotal moment, what is it that we can do to make a real lasting impact and change? And in a moment, we're going to show you a video, which won't be a surprise to most of you, but we'll explain the context to you after we show the video. And we have this terrific group of panelists, some of whom are dear friends, some of whom we've worked with, and we think that you'll be delighted. They bring perspectives from across the spectrum, and their experience is just incredible. So hopefully tonight we'll move forward, and we'll have some answers, and we'll probably have a lot more questions, but we'd like to do something here which really changes what we think is a catalyzing moment and answers some of the questions that we all have about the issues that we're about to talk about. Thank you.
So with that, for those of you who are generational colleagues of mine, and even for those who are of the generation that follows me, Cecile and her generational colleagues, for all of you, the name Anita Hill is one that resonates, not just in political history, but in the broader history of our country and our society. And what we thought is even though the focus of tonight's conversation is on what comes next, it's not that hard for us to agree that egregious and appalling behavior in the workplace and society should not be accepted and should not be permitted. That's the easy part. The question is, how do we move forward in a way that learns from these transgressions and helps us all together create a new set of rules and new set of guidelines to navigate this very unfamiliar landscape. And as Cecile mentioned, we've got a tremendous panel whom we'll introduce to you in just a minute to help guide us through that conversation. But because the Anita Hill moment in our nation's history is such a seminal one, we believe that before we can talk about what comes next, it's important to take a short look back. And for those of you, I'll just say, some of you have heard me say this before, who, like me, are of a certain age, a lot of this will be very familiar. For those of you who are somewhat younger, you might recognize the name or know a bit about the history. But it is said, as all of you know, that those of us who do not understand history are condemned to repeat it. And so using this video as a starting point for tonight's conversation, we think is a particularly important foundation from which to build. Maestro?
Professor Anita Hill interrupted dinner with her mother, but would not declare one way or another how she felt about the Thomas confirmation vote.
Do you have anything to say to Justice Thomas?
I have no comment on that, really. As I say, my focus is really on what has happened this past week and what I believe has come out of it.
What Anita Hill would talk about was her public disclosure that the Supreme Court justice had sexually harassed her.
One of the things that has happened over the last week is that people have started to talk about this issue. It's almost as though silence has been broken, and women who are talking about experiences that they had never spoken about before. And that should not die.
Hill had spent Senate voting day dodging reporters, attempting to return to a normal routine, teaching 2 afternoon law classes. There was a constant flow of flowers from supporters, and her students watching the vote were disappointed with the outcome.
I believe what Anita says is true, and I think that it's just a tragedy. It just makes me very, very sad.
If they can do that to a woman of her stature, imagine what they can do to a woman who just works at the 7-Eleven, or to a woman who has no credit. But what would they do to me?
After a week of being thrust into the national spotlight, Professor Hill will now try to settle back in her home state, where both U.S. senators dismissed her allegations and voted to confirm Thomas. Would she do it all over again?
And I'm not sure I could have lived with myself if I had answered those questions, the Senate staff questions, any differently. I couldn't sleep probably as well as I can sleep tonight.
The university will now try and put all
In addition to Anita Hill, you saw just a glimpse here of one of the most accomplished broadcast journalists of her or any other generation. The woman who you can barely see on screen now, her name is Cinny Kennard, and she is an award-winning journalist and media executive who has played groundbreaking roles in the media at CBS News, at National Public Radio, and now serves as the president and CEO of the Annenberg Foundation in Los Angeles. Why do we know so much about Cinny Kennard? Because she's our friend, and she's our guest tonight. Cinny, thank you so much for being here. Let me introduce our other panelists before we get started. And even though Cindy is the only person on the panel tonight who interviewed Anita Hill at the height of the Thomas Hill hearings, I think you'll agree by the time I'm done that as proud as we are, as proud as Cecile and I are, of the tremendous talent that we've been able to bring to Ojai for our past panels, I think a couple hours from now you'll agree to us that, all modesty aside, we've outdone ourselves. Because along with Cindy, also joining us tonight is our friend Shakari Byerly. Shakari is the managing partner of Moderators, which is one of the most respected public opinion and political consulting firms in California. She's an expert on public opinion research, and we're thrilled to have her here tonight as well. Shakari, thank you so much for coming. We're also especially pleased, not only because he's an incredibly talented journalist as well, but because he came here all the way from Washington, D.C. in order to join us tonight. Ted Johnson is a senior editor at Variety, and shortly after the 2016 election, after years of working for Variety in that senior capacity here in Los Angeles, was sent to Washington, D.C. to open their first bureau there. Ted, for many years, has written a landmark column called Wilshire in Washington. He now hosts a tremendous podcast on Sirius XM called Pop Politics. And once again, for some reason, and we're very, very grateful for it, was willing to fly 6,000 miles round trip to be here for our conversation tonight. Ted, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you for being here. We're also very, very lucky to be joined here tonight by yet another friend of ours. And I'm going to tell you about Ana Cubas, who is one of the most respected leaders in politics and government at the local level in Los Angeles, at the state level in California, and the federal level in the United States government, over an extraordinary career in public service. Most recently, Ana serves as has been the founder and is now the executive director of the South LA Political Action Committee, and something in particular that we're excited to talk with her about tonight. She's the founder and the director of the Latina Public Service Academy in downtown Los Angeles, which prepares young Latinas to become part, and a most critical part of our next generation of community leaders. Ana, thank you so much for being here tonight. And I think that's it, isn't it? Oh. Our friend Tom Krause, not just mine and Cecile's friend, but all of our friend Tom Krause, needs no introduction, but you know what, he's going to get one anyway. All of you have known Tom longer than we have and better than we do, and for that we're very, very jealous of all of you, because he's become someone who's not only become a good friend, but somebody who we both really admire and have been thrilled to work with as part of this Chautauqua series. Tom and his wife Catherine, Tom and Esther Wachtel, and so many other of you, like I said earlier, have set an example for how communities ought to conduct these conversations. And no one has given more of themselves to this than Tom Krause. Tom, as you know, is the president of the Ojai Chautauqua Committee. He's an entrepreneur. He's a consultant. He's an author. He's a speaker on cultural change, on cognitive bias, on leadership development, and on executive decision-making. This is truly a Renaissance man and a good friend of all of ours. Tom, thank you for taking the step and joining us.
And before we start the program, there's actually somebody who we should thank, and that's Andy Gilman. So thanks very much, Andy, for all the logistical support. Oh, and thank you for all the volunteers. You'll notice that all these young people out there, they're volunteering to be part of this. So we're very thankful for them, and we look forward to seeing them one day on stage.
And just to warn these impressive young people that one day is not far away. Start getting yourselves ready. Okay. So we're going to do a few things tonight. We want to divide the bulk of the conversation into two categories. Most simply put is what's new and what's different. In other words, why has this moment created this kind of environment in a way that similar challenges in our communities and societies never had in the past? Second, we want to talk about what comes next and hear from our panelists about what they believe might be part of the most important next steps forward. And third, and most importantly, as Cecile and Andy both mentioned, we want to hear from all of you. And in a short while, we'll ask you to begin putting questions down on cards that we can put to the panelists before the end of tonight's program. But what Cecile and I have learned over the course of this programming is that the best questions come not from the podium, well, that might change tonight, but come not from the podium, but come from those of you in the community. And so we really hope as many of you as possible do decide to write in questions, and particularly for the high school students in the room, we make an extra effort to make sure that your questions get asked, and we'd ask everyone to put their name on the card, unless they prefer to remain anonymous, of course. We'd ask that the high school students include their name and the school they represent, so we understand which teachers and which principals to thank for such impressive young future leaders. So with that, we've seen the Anita Hill video, and in just a moment, we're going to ask our panelists to weigh in with their thoughts. But we're particularly fortunate to have Cinny with us tonight, and we're hoping that before we get into this broader conversation, Cinny, maybe you can give us a little bit of background, tell us about the interview, and then we'll propel the conversation forward.
Oh, that would be my pleasure, and thanks to both of you, and I'm so pleased to be here tonight. I just want those of you in this room, how many of you remember watching those 5 days of grueling testimony live in your living room on television? Okay. How many of you remember that, and for those of you who didn't, I just want to remind you that the allegations were that Hill had accused Thomas of repeatedly making overtly sexual comments to her when she actually worked for him at the U.S. Department of Education and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that shocking testimony, of course, was broadcast live. And if you remember, I think the trigger was, more than almost anything, that all-male white panel that sat there and asked her those tough, grueling questions through that period. I'll just, on a personal note, share what Dan asked me to, which was, I actually was at her house the night that the vote was taken. So I was in Oklahoma. That's where you saw her. That was a time, if you all remember, that everybody thought this woman was just doing this because she wanted to be a big Hollywood star and write a best-selling book. And she was going to have this huge career with all these Clegg lights and maybe even win an Oscar. But I found her in her house alone, cooking dinner for her 90-something-year-old mother that night, reluctant to come out. She just didn't want to come out of the house. There was a scrum of reporters, of which I was one of them, and they were mostly male reporters. And I finally knocked on the door, and she kind of kicked the door open and looked at me, and I said, "I'm begging you to come out here, because the women in this country need to hear from you tonight, please." And so anyway, she came out, and that's what you saw as the interview. So as Dan said, we don't want to remain in the past, but she's very much a part of our future right now, because there is a strong likelihood that we're at a turning point in this country on this particular issue. In the last couple of months, a tidal wave has exploded with groups and commissions in Hollywood and in other areas to look at this issue and figure out how do we go forward. Anita Hill is in fact chair of the Commission on Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equality in the Workplace and is now spending most of her time in Los Angeles, helping Hollywood try to define what equality looks like and what not only talking about sexual harassment, but ending it once and for all. And then we all know about Time's Up, which Ted probably can really address much closer than I can. So I think the question for tonight to Dan and Cecile's point is, how do we go forward? And to me, after 27 long years, which some things changed. We had the Year of the Woman. We had some legislatures passing laws across the country in the aftermath of Anita Hill. In that chapter, toughening up sexual harassment regulations in the workplace. But I think we're at a turning point. I think we're at a turning point. I don't know whether the rest of the panel agrees with me on this.
I think absolutely.
Yep, that's on.
Okay, perfect. I would absolutely agree that there's a shift occurring. Can you hear? Is this better?
Much better.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. You know, what our public opinion research suggests is that we're in a moment where the American public understands that sexual harassment is not just an issue of a few men who are, you know, failed Romeos, so to speak, that are cracking jokes and flirting with women at work, but that there's a serious problem with men in power who are abusing that power toward the end of humiliating and diminishing and marginalizing women. 54% of women, American women, say that they've experienced sexual harassment at work. A quarter say that they've experienced such harassment from their male colleagues. A third say that they've experienced that from a colleague or boss who has the potential to impact their career chances. How appalling is that? 86% of Americans say that we should have a zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment. That's not to say there aren't fault lines. We also have it's a highly partisan issue in some respects, which may be similar to what we saw in the 80s with sexual harassment. There's an age component, and I think part of what makes this moment unique is that we are at a time when the millennials are coming of age politically. This is a generation who has grown up in a social media and technology environment. So it's not just one woman facing Supreme Court hearings. With the Me Too movement, we saw a sea of women coming forward and sharing that they too had had negative experiences. And I think that that is why we're seeing such shifts in public opinion.
I do remember the hearings. I don't know if my mic is working. There we go. And I'd like to make two distinctions between then and now, and what we're seeing now with hashtag #MeToo and hashtag Time's Up. One is obviously the availability of social media, where we have women from all over the country, all over the world, sharing these excruciating, deep, personal stories that go beyond sexual harassment. And it's sexual violence, assault, and rape. So the severity of what's been shared, I believe, is something we need to address. That's different than Anita Hill. Number two, going to what's different is, besides social media, is you have had the federal elections of 2016, which we all know very well how it turned out, but two aspects of it impacted directly the Me Too movement. One is we had for the first time a female presidential candidate that brought to many women a new consciousness, political consciousness that wasn't there before. And two, you had the winning candidate who had been on record as making statements that basically, if you grab them by the you can flirt with women that way. So a man who in public had, or at least being recorded, had admitted to this was the way he thought of things. And when he was elected, it led to the Women's March in January of 2017, where over 5 and 6 million women in the country and internationally marched for the first time as a group. And that has led to this groundswell of women speaking up and speaking out and sharing these stories that when we talk about what's next, my phrase is always accountability and tough love. We can't let this moment go by without addressing it.
Okay, and Anna, we're going to want to come back to you in just a minute or two to talk in a little bit more detail about what comes next on the political front. What I'd like to do is to bring Ted Johnson into the conversation, because of course these are challenges, as all of you know, that are not unique to the political landscape. And while Ted, from his unique perspective in Washington, covers both politics and the entertainment industry, I guess the question I'd like to put to you, Ted, is outside of politics, whether it's in the entertainment world or elsewhere, what do you see as having changed? I know you've given a lot of thought to the differences in the way media considers these kind of issues, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, watching the Anita Hill tape, I started covering the entertainment industry it must have been about 5 years after that. So it was still within memory and within consciousness. And I remember when I started covering entertainment, a number of journalists talked about kind of these vague rumors that a lot of studio executives often got hit with sexual harassment complaints, and that they always had to do settlements. And it's interesting because the reaction that you would have in newsrooms was much more like the reaction to Anita Hill. It was you either believed her or you believed Clarence Thomas, and if you believed Clarence Thomas, you believed, oh, Anita Hill is in it for the money and the fame. And that was a pervasive thought in entertainment as well, that there were women out there who were trying to sue their employer, and they were just in it for the money or the fame. And I just think, I mean, it's an appalling thought, that was kind of the mindset within the entertainment industry at the time. So that certainly has changed, and there's something that we talked about a lot right after the Harvey Weinstein story, and it's called an open secret. Harvey Weinstein, the allegations that were against him were somewhat known within the entertainment community and also within the entertainment journalism community. It's just no one had been able to verify them until the New York Times and the New Yorker broke the story and came up with these accounts of multiple allegations. And as it turned out, it was a lot worse, I think, than many journalists realized. I think that this whole idea, though, of an open secret, especially in newsrooms, when you hear about something like that, the tendency, I think, is going to be to prioritize that, certainly now. But I think rather than say, well, that is a story we should have a handle on, let's work on it when we get done with our daily stories. I think that is something that is going to change or that has changed when there is an allegation. That's the priority now, especially at this moment. And the other thing that is changing as well is we are seeing I think more accountability to the executives or people who may have, for lack of a better term, enabled this type of behavior by having knowledge of it and signing, entered into some kind of a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement. And we're seeing some accountability. Last night, the president of the Weinstein Company, he was actually fired for cause because he had knowledge of what was going on with Harvey Weinstein and did not take proper action to address that problem. Finally, I just have to say, from a journalistic standpoint, I don't think this change would have happened had these women not gone on the record, because that made all the difference. When Rose McGowan, when Ashley Judd, when they came forward and actually went on the record, that gave their stories a lot more credibility.
What she said in that video, you heard her say, the silence, you can no longer be silenced. And I think, to your point, and Dan and Cecile, it can't be said enough, and audience, of course, the wall of silence has collapsed. It's completely collapsed. From the broadcast networks to the factory floors to Washington to Hollywood, that silence that existed before has collapsed.
Thank you. We're going to take a moment here because we realize most people in this room probably haven't worked in politics or been in the entertainment industry, and for that we're going to turn to Tom Krause, who's going to talk a little bit about what he has seen in the workplace and what he believes should and could happen to go forward.
So just quickly about the videotape. I had a similar reaction to yours, Cindy, in that Anita Hill saying that the wall has been broken and now we're going to start talking about these things was really interesting and encouraging. I'm also struck by how long it has been and how little progress has seemingly been made. So it does seem like a turning point is in front of us, but I hope we can figure out how to do the right things so that in 27 more years we're not kind of still sitting here and thinking about it. The other thing that struck me about hearing that was how credible Anita Hill was. It was apparent that she was coming from her home and that she was not prepared. It wasn't a news conference. She was speaking spontaneously. And the sense of her person that came across was just entirely believable. At the same time, Clarence Thomas was not heard. And so it reminded me of what I felt like back then, which was, well, who am I supposed to believe here? And how am I supposed to think about this? Because there's not due process to rely on, which is, a mechanism that has evolved over centuries and that really works, at least works well in many cases, most cases. But in this case, we don't have the benefit of that. So it seems to me...
Well, I think he got to call it a high-tech lynching, if you remember correctly. And he did get quite a viewing without taking either side, just to make sure that I remain in my journalism DNA. He really did have quite a hearing in front of the American people live on broadcast television to defend himself.
Certainly. I didn't mean to suggest that he didn't. I'm just suggesting that as a viewer watching this, I'm struck by, well, I know there's another side to this.
Yes,
and I would like to know what that other side is. And after I know it, I still am not going to feel like I'm really in a position to make a judgment about it. And due process is the mechanism for that, and we don't have it. So it seems to me that is a problem we have to figure out how to handle in the workplace. I'm familiar with one situation that actually happened in the last few months where an accusation was made. The individual who was accused had his career ruined, and 2 months later, the accusation was reversed. And the lawyer who was involved in it said he has seen that multiple times. And so, that's a real problem. So how do we figure out how to do that?
So, Tom, let me ask you this question. Ted said something that really struck me, both in its own right and how interested I'd be in getting your perspective in it. Ted talked about, as you heard, about the change in attitudes at the top of the studios among many, not all of course, among many of the top executives in the entertainment industry, and how that is an essential part of change moving forward. And I suspect that that's not unique, as Cecile was mentioning a moment ago, either to the entertainment industry or to the political sector. As an expert on workplace behavior and leadership development, maybe you can talk about the tone, the example, the guidance that a leader can set in the workplace to help make these changes happen.
So in my view, this is essentially an organizational problem. And it's essentially an organizational culture problem. That is, a culture exists in which these kinds of things are tolerated, looked the other way about, not spoken of. People who know about it don't say anything, and so forth. And I think we know from clear, demonstrable research that leadership has the capacity to change the culture of the organization. And so having the senior-most person and their team dedicated to, we're not going to tolerate these things. We're going to figure out how to get metrics on them. We're going to figure out processes that affect those metrics. We're going to track that stuff over time. We're going to do more than training, which everybody thinks is a joke and no one takes seriously. We're going to actually look at systems for how we prevent this from occurring. That's all doable. And I think it takes some resolve on the part of CEOs. Ideally, they would do it because it's the right thing to do, but they also might do it because it's good business, and it certainly is good business. I mean, having a negative workplace is not good for business. It doesn't increase the share price or profitability or any other of the things that businesses want. And similarly with government agencies and other non-business entities, they don't function well when they have a negative work environment. So hopefully we'll see senior executives come forward for various reasons and say, let's figure out how to fix this.
And I know that Shakari wants to weigh in, but I think for those of us who haven't had those of you who haven't had the good fortune that I have to hear Tom make that point before, to me, I think it's such a critically important one. Many of us want to live in a world in which everyone we know does the right thing because it's the right thing. And the point that Tom made, which is I think worth a little bit further consideration as we go through the conversation, is for all the people in our community, like all of you, who will do the right thing because it's the right thing, other people might be more incentivized because it's the smart thing to do. And if I'm a CEO or a manager and I create a hostile workplace, that's not just unethical or immoral, it's bad business, because the most impressive young people in my community aren't going to want to work in my business anymore. Tom, I think it's an important point, and I'm glad you made it. Shakari?
And I would agree. I think what can be different this time around is thinking about how do we change institutions to eliminate, to make it, to disincentivize kind of the aggression and the culture of domination that exists within organizations. How can we model good behavior, which I think comes from the top, from leadership. But I think we also have to pay attention to a broader cultural shift that needs to happen. I think one of the amazing things about this time is that we have people across the age spectrum coming forward. I grew up in the 80s, so I remember that the hearings were televised in my living room, but it was largely seen as an adult conversation. These were things that were happening in corporate America or in politics and didn't really have anything to do with me as a young person, per se. And I think what's different about this time is that we're seeing women of all ages come forward. I think of the young female gymnasts that have come forward, over 200 of them. First, how could we let this happen? 30 years from Anita Hill, how could this still be happening? So we have to ask ourselves, how can we change the conversations with our daughters and with our sons so that this stops happening?
Dan, can I just also salute Tom for saying something that is so critical, and that is leadership in an organization. But somehow I'd like to just take that a step further, which is to say, who are those leaders, and what is the demographic of those leaders that are involved in these organizational positions that are making these critical decisions. There are still only 26 CEOs that are female in this country, and that's 5%. And we all know that the CEO of a company generally leads not only that organization, but that culture. And let me add to that the boards in this country. We have got to get better at this. We know the importance of a board of directors at a company and the pressure that that board can put on a CEO and the leadership of that corporation. Our numbers, 27% of females on boards in this country. We just have got to get better about this. We've grown up as a country. We salute, I hope, for the most part, our diversity, but it's got to be in more critical decision-making positions in this country in order to affect any of this change. Just real quickly, I was telling the group when we were together a little earlier today, I was at a panel last week with the former, probably she was number 2, Ted, you have to help me, at Disney, a woman by the name of Anne Sweeney, who had a remarkable career at Disney, who is now retired and I think went off onto her own business, but she just got on the board of Netflix. And she stood in front of this audience last week and basically acknowledged that the number 2, I think, at Netflix got into trouble for allegations of sexual harassment. And it was her voice on that board that said, get him out of here. That this cannot go on, that we cannot at Netflix have a culture like this. So I think that kind of a voice on these boards and these kinds of leaders in these companies can contribute to us accelerating these changes and not waiting 27 years.
I just want to add 2 things to that point. I think, especially in entertainment, the way that some of these sexual harassment allegations had been solved up until very recently was to make some kind of a settlement and to make a confidential settlement where none of the parties could ever talk about it again. And I think that is going to probably have boards across entertainment and probably across corporate America looking and saying, is that the right thing to do? Is that the right thing to do in this situation? After all, some of the women who have come forward are also at very strong legal risk because they violated some of these confidentiality agreements, but they came forward anyway. That's what we've seen in the past few months. But I think those are legal questions that the board is going to have. There's also the question of, if you know that your executive signed one of these confidentiality agreements, you also have knowledge of what's going on. Does that put the company itself at risk?
Anna's going to weigh in now, and she's going to tell you something which you probably didn't know were happening with your tax dollars.
Well, from the political perspective, having been a staffer most of my career, and you've worked in City Hall too, you understand communications. When you are an elected official or a staff member to an elected official, you should be held to a higher standard. The training that I remember was, imagine your emails, your text messages on the front page of the LA Times. How you conduct yourself at public meetings can be recorded. So all of you should hold your elected officials to a higher standard, which is really what many elected officials that had been accused and investigated. So this was just beyond an accusation, by the way. There was due process within the state legislature in that there was an investigation internally. The members were warned by that investigator not to continue that behavior, but they did. And I want to emphasize, too, the distinction between harassment and sexual violence and assault, because one assembly member who has since resigned, by the way, I'll just give you an example of what happened. So the incident was a lobbyist, a woman, was led into the bathroom by him, and then he exposed himself. It goes beyond saying things to a woman like honey or dear in the workplace. And luckily, he and another assembly member who had a pattern also of bad behavior, bordering on sexual assault and violence, have since resigned. And in both those assembly districts, there are women running for office to replace them. And I'm very glad and happy to hear that.
Anna, can you talk a little bit about settlements in politics?
About the legislation that's been under
Absolutely.
consideration.
So in terms of solutions, the legislature has acted very quickly. They've set up a select committee to hear issues and investigate, headed up by Laura Friedman. But they've also very importantly have said that the settlements that go towards these types of cases can no longer be paid out of the public fund, your tax dollars, but they have to be paid out by that individual personally, which I applaud. And I can't believe that that wasn't the case before. And then other legislation to protect whistleblowers in the state employees. And I do believe that we need a tough love approach. We do need legislation like the one I just mentioned, and those individuals have to be prosecuted, not in public opinion, but by the police. If it is sexual assault or rape, that is a felony, and they should be in jail. They should not be walking the halls of Sacramento or the halls of City Hall. They should be in jail, prosecuted, have their due process in court.
So I want to come back to Anna again in just a couple of minutes, because in addition to the two members of the legislature who she talked about, the most recent to take a leave of absence because of this type of behavior was in fact a female member of the California State Legislature. And it's an important reminder to us that as much as this is about gender, it's even more about power and power imbalance. But before we move on, I want to take just another minute to expand on a piece of legislation that she referenced as it related to whistleblowers. As most of you know, when an individual works in a government office, if they see something inappropriate, immoral, illegal, they are not only encouraged to report that, they are provided certain protections that they will not be fired for making that information known to the appropriate authorities. And for many, many years in the state of California, if you worked in any government office, you were protected under the whistleblower statute, unless you worked for the California State Legislature. And legislative employees, men and women who worked for our elected state assembly members and state senators, were not protected. And for the last 4 years, a state assembly member from Lake Elsinore by the name of Melissa Melendez has introduced legislation to include those whistleblower protections on legislative employees as well. And for 4 years, her bill was never even heard in the appropriate committee. This year, it passed the legislature on unanimous consent. So even though there is a great deal left to be done, as Anna correctly pointed out, it's worth taking a moment to remind all of us how important the additional visibility and the additional conversations like these can lead to real difference.
I wanted to get back to Tom and have him talk a little bit about due process, because as you said, in the Anita Hill case, it was a he said, she said situation. Isn't that the way it usually is?
Right, but I think that's a real problem, and I don't know how. I don't think we have a mechanism in place to deal with that problem now. So if it's a celebrity, I mean, one of the things that has changed, seems to me, recently that's opened the door in a big way is that we have had celebrities, and we now have connectivity all over the place. So you don't just hear from one person. If there are others, we hear from 10 in a short amount of time, and that changes the perspective and the need for due process. But there are all sorts of difficulties at the organizational level for how we handle it. So when a complaint comes forward, first of all, does it get reported? Are there incentives in place that cause it not to get reported? And if it gets reported, then who does what? And where does that lead? And how do you assure that you're making the right decision, that you're not punishing someone when you don't really know what happened.
Right, but and I don't mean to pick on you, but isn't that why women don't report? Because it does end up being he said, she said, and they don't want to ruin their lives either.
Of course, but the solution to that isn't to say a single voice is due process. I mean, so somehow that seems to me that has to be figured out. That has to be part of what needs to be done. I wanted to also comment that I completely agree that more women leaders on boards and CEOs and executives is a very good thing. And I think that's a trend. It's happening now, and I think it'd be good to accelerate that. But I hope that that doesn't mean that men get off the hook. That is to say, it seems to me to conceive of this as a women's problem is not the best way to think about it. That it seems to me this is a leadership problem. And we ought to hold our male leaders in organizations accountable and require that they address this in a significant way. I mean, this isn't something that I should be concerned about because of gender. I should be concerned about it because it's unjust and it's bad business, and it is a not how an organization should function.
But there's something that has just gone on for so many years. When I think of even on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., how could it be that all those settlements were made behind closed doors with our taxpayer money, yes, and it was condoned? I mean, wasn't there a voice of reason somewhere? And to your point, gender-wise, culture, what is wrong with a culture that nobody stands up and says, there's something fundamentally wrong with this? And you're right. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily gender, although I would argue that, that there are studies after studies that reveal that women in decision-making positions create different kinds of cultures in the workplace for the most part.
So I think that's true.
That there sometimes is a different level of compassion and empathy that is displayed. That is not to criticize the other side. I don't want to declare that in any strong way. But it is what it is, frankly, and study after study has shown that.
Yeah, we don't disagree about that.
And I do want to jump in about that, because now's the perfect time to talk about Assemblymember Cristina Garcia. She is a female elected official, a trailblazer, but yet she herself has been accused of the same behavior that she was persecuting her colleagues about. And so my overarching conclusion has been that when you have bad leaders, whether it's men or women, the institution has a horrible problem. And we all have to hold that leader accountable. Men have to hold bad men leaders accountable. Women have to hold bad men leaders accountable. Women have to hold the bad women leaders accountable. And so in terms of what's the aftermath of this Me Too movement, now you are beginning to see the tables turned and looking at who is making these accusations and what is their own personal track record. And I don't want it to detract from the horrendous stories that we've heard from so many women, but it does mean that when you are in a position of power, you should be held accountable to a higher standard. That includes private and public sector leaders, men and women.
So Ted, I know that you want to weigh in, but I want to ask a question of Shakari to follow up on what we've been talking about first, and then we promise to come right to you. Shakari, Tom and Cinny and Anna in different ways have all talked about the role of the leader. One of the things I've heard you talk about, which I find really important and really interesting, is the role of the colleague. And while changes in leadership, as Cindy correctly points out, can change a workplace, while changes in the leader's attitudes, as Tom correctly points out, can change a workplace, the way we form networks in the workplace and in the community have an impact also. And I'm wondering if you can talk not just about leadership roles, but the peer-to-peer dynamic and how that affects these
Absolutely.
situations.
I think that's vital. As Tom has said in our private conversations, much of the harassment occurs behind closed doors or out of public view. But there are often things that are said, crude language or crude jokes that are made in peer circles. And that's a problem. And I think it's important for, good men and good women not to remain silent in the presence of that type of behavior. It's absolutely unacceptable. Part of the challenge, I think, in building consensus and promoting organizational change is that, there's a serious partisan dimension to this conversation. When you have 52% of Republican women, that's white women, that supported Donald Trump in spite of the crude comments in the Access Hollywood tape, I mean, that suggests that there are differing views between Republican women and Democratic women, and there's also an intersectional component. And what we found in public opinion research, in this highly polarized and partisan environment, it's important that people hear from others in their social circles. So men need to talk to other men. Women need to talk to other women about their bad behavior. I think that's critical. We aren't going to solve the problem of echo chambers in this social media environment. At least, I think there's progress to be made. But part of the answer is people talking within their existing social networks. I think organizational leaders need to open up and expand their circles when they're thinking about hiring. We can have diversity policies in place, but often it's the job announcement that gets circulated in those informal social networks that block out or exclude people from opportunity. So before it hits the public message board or it's disseminated broadly, I'll share that opportunity with my college classmate or colleague before I extend it to others. So changing the individual behavior and culture has to be a part of the solution.
Thank you, Shakari.
Thank you. Ted, please.
What I was going to say is, you were talking just about social networks. I think it works. Both ways as well. I mean, the negative and the positive. I think more women coming forward are more likely now to share what happened with their friends, or anyone who's experienced harassment is more likely to share that with their friends, which in turn helps their case. When they bring it to their company, they now have some verification. And I was just going to say what also I think has changed in journalism is these women have come forward, and what looked like a he said, she said situation isn't so, that's not so much the case when you have an accuser and a reporter can go to some of their friends, or they posted something on social media that is almost evidence in that situation to make their claims actually a lot more credible. And we've seen that with a number of different stories recently, where they've been able to go to friends and verify that you said this to me back 5 years ago. So I think that's a difference that we're seeing right now. So it's not it's not necessarily the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas situation where it was he said, she said. Now it seems that there is more opportunity to find proof, for lack of a better term.
So I'd like to give our panel, even though we're only at the halfway point now, I'd already like to give them a tremendous amount of credit, not just for being really smart and really insightful, but for not willing to abide by the structure of the discussion that we laid out. And to their credit, they deserve tremendous credit, is rather than simply talking about how we got here and what's changed and why this is different, to their credit, they've already pushed the conversation forward into our next component as to what's next. What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing? What steps can we be taking? And the fact that that part of the conversation has already begun, I think, is tremendous, and we want to continue it in just a moment. Before we do, though, we want to remind you that we do have this remarkable group of young people from both Oak Grove and from Villanova who are going to be picking up your question cards in the next several minutes. So if you haven't yet had a chance to write a question either directed toward one of our panelists or a question that you'd like the entire panel to weigh in on, we'd ask you as the conversation continues to take a few minutes to write down a question, then we'll collect them in just a short while. Since we're speaking of amazing young people, I was going to say Anna, because of course you're an amazing young person, but beyond that, you mentor a group of amazing young people at your Leadership Academy. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how a challenge like this one manifests itself as we prepare our next generation of leaders for this kind of dynamic. Talk about the young women you work with and how you prepare them to confront these challenges even more successfully than you've been able to.
Well, the Academy is now 5 years old, and we train every year in April 25 young women in high school, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Young women who are very savvy. They use social media all the time. And the key element in the Academy that transcends all aspects of their life is empowerment. And we go through this exercise called the power of choice. How everything that you do and you say in your life is a product of your choice. And so for me and for them, because they've shared this with me, that is the most important and most powerful workshop that we have. And so with that understanding of empowerment and choice, they can transform their lives. They can transform the lives of the people in their community. However, I've noticed now other leadership workshops for young ladies which now have a very distinct time slot for dealing with sexual harassment. And this year, my academy will have a very specific slot devoted to talking about that. And again, I want to make the distinction too between harassment and violence. Because if you look at most of the Me Too postings from all over the world, the majority of them deal with sexual violence.
So since we have begun the conversation now about preparing the next generation for these challenges, I see that we've been joined by some of those amazing young leaders from Oak Grove and from Villanova. And so I want to keep this conversation going about the next generation. Now, Cinny, you've spent a lot of time thinking about the role that technology can play, not just for young people, but for the rest of us in giving us tools to address these challenges.
So we know the numbers now that the average age 8 to 18 probably spends at least 7 hours a day on a device, whether it's a telephone, whether it's an iPad, and the computer for what remains of those who are interested in a computer anymore. But I thought it was interesting that one of the headlines I've read most recently about kind of changing what Tom referenced, which is how do you come into these workplaces and educate and inform people about sexual harassment? And so many of these workplaces now, it is part of the obligatory duties of each employee to take an online test about sexual harassment. And you kind of have these animated characters come up. And I have to tell you, as a leader of many workplaces in the last decade or so, my employees, it's like dragging and kicking and screaming to get them to take that exam and that education and informed. But anyway, the good news for the younger generation is there is actually a high-powered executive that just left 21st Century Fox in Los Angeles to actually create an app for reporting sexual harassment. Anonymously, exactly. Thanks, Dan. And the name of it, the app is called All Voices. And this is a relatively new, I think it was late last fall, that a group of women came together, and they actually did get some venture capital funding on this app to create a place where you could actually privately report sexual harassment. So it still seems to be behind, but we've got to make these kinds of instruction, informative discussions occur in a much more modern fashion in order to raise this incredible, I'm very excited by your generation, by the way, you guys. Very, very, very excited. I think you're Generation Z, or at least part of that. And I think you're going to be about the best since the baby boomers. But anyway, just saying. Just saying.
Us Gen Xers would disagree.
I don't know about those Xers, but the Zs, I have.
I want to add too, Cindy, if I may.
Yes, please do.
I think there is some evidence, some reason for hope, at least a glimmer of it. MTV did a study of 18 to 25-year-olds late last year about the Me Too campaign. And 40% of young men said that the Me Too campaign, hearing about their friends and family members who had experienced sexual violence or sexual assault, made them think about their own interactions. And I think a key to what's next is people interrogating their own personal behavior. Not in a way that's accusatory, because I think that generates resentment and causes people to be dismissive and is counterproductive. But as we have these conversations in our social circles and in our social networks, it's people reflecting on their own behavior and what they could have done differently. And so I'm encouraged to know that some of that is happening. Now, 2 and 5, we still got a long way to go. But I think that is remarkable, and it speaks to the power of social media.
Right, so Shakari, just to follow up before we come to Ted, one of the things I know you've also spent a lot of time talking about is how these emerging generations of leaders not only can use these technological tools, but how it creates a different and more collaborative type of attitude. When you grow up social networking, you tend to think of networks not just virtual, but in the real world in a different way, and that might provide some tools in this regard. Can it not?
I think absolutely. I think there's still work to do. I mean, I teach undergraduates at UCLA who are interested in, social movements and civic engagement and activism. And they're looking for tools and guidance on how to go beyond the hashtag. So how can we create forums like these for our young people to have the conversation that we as adults are having? I think that's part of the solution.
I was just going to say that at the same time the Me Too movement started, for the past couple years in entertainment, there has been a lot of talk about the lack of diversity in the entertainment business. This is especially apparent when you look at the hiring of female directors. There was actually, the federal government actually came and investigated the entertainment industry back in the early 90s because there were so few female directors who were hired, and nothing changed after that, even after the federal government came in. I think there's a lot of hope among, certainly among directors, that this will also be a catalyst for change. And the reason this is so important is it has to do with content. It has to do with the movies and TV shows that people are going to watch. We're seeing some signs of that. It's certainly in the zeitgeist. Wonder Woman got a lot of attention for women's empowerment when that came out last year. We're going to see a lot around this movie called A Wrinkle in Time, which is directed by Ava DuVernay. It's one of the few action movies that is big tentpole action movies that has been directed by a woman. And I think probably the hopes is, we were talking about this at lunch, back when the women's movement started in the early 1970s, if you looked at movies and TV shows after that, there's a big case to be made that the response from the entertainment industry was to make movies, we call them Women in Jeopardy TV movies where women were always in peril. And you can't help but think that's because there weren't those female executives, there weren't those female directors, there weren't those female writers, and this was kind of the male response to what was happening at the political level. So I think that one thing to really watch is this change in content. Is it more diverse? Are the characters more true to what's happening in real life?
And what do they do with female characters? Honestly, I mean, it's always been, Ted is quoting, or began to talk about the research and data that has been done so brilliantly by Dr. Stacy Smith, who's a professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communications in Los Angeles. And she repeatedly does study after study on gender in Hollywood and the differences in content when there are female directors or diverse directors involved in generating this content, and how the storyline is different and how the characters are portrayed. And there's a level of sensitivity, how when women are in positions of being the director, they hire more women. And so we only stand to benefit as a society through diversity, through illuminating, through amplifying this great treasure that our country has. And somehow we get stalled through periods, whether it takes us 27 years or not. Hopefully this is one of those turning points.
And I should add too, we can't emphasize that point enough, and I know this is a favorite for Cinny, is, with Ava DuVernay and the Black Panther movie coming out this weekend. I think the symbolism of having people of color headline, both behind the camera as well as in front of it, is important. We haven't talked about intersectionality, but the fact that Anita Hill was an African-American woman accusing an African-American man, and the race and gender fault lines that created, was a big part of what we saw in the 80s. This movement broke, and the Me Too hashtag was promoted by Alyssa Milano, I think, first. But it was actually an African-American woman in 2006 who created the hashtag. So I think there's a race and gender component to this that we really need to be aware of. And having our celebrities and our media reflect those diverse voices is important to adding credibility when those women come out and speak up.
And
we did say that we were going to talk a little bit about some of the positive things that are happening. So I just wanted to mention, when you go home, if you have sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandsons, granddaughters, there is a movement that Emma Watson of Harry Potter fame has started. It's called He for She, and it's all about getting young men involved in this movement so that for the next generation, it doesn't become a he said, she said, that it really is something that is shared by all young people. And I think that this generation, the next generation coming up, will be very, very eager to be part of that, because they really do see the world differently.
What does that look like?
He for she, it's, you can go, if you just go to the website, you can type, yep. It is a United Nations program, and Emma Watson is a spokesperson. And the idea is all around the world to get young men aware of these issues so that they can behave better as young men.
Well, in terms of the entertainment industry, what I love about our technology these days is that all of us are content creators, and I'd like to see more young women become their own producers and directors. You can do it on your iPhone. You can create your own YouTube channel that is good content. But in terms of the future and what I'd like to see, while it's true you cannot legislate morality, you can certainly legislate and prosecute bad behavior. And you have examples, international examples, in most Latin American countries, when the party runs candidates, that the party commits and is mandated to have a certain percentage of their slate be women. And I know, Cecile, you were mentioning earlier in the UK, companies are mandated to have a certain percentage of their board of directors be women. And I would, for the future, I'd like to see that. I would like to have our public officials take on those types of legislation, because I don't know if people will do that voluntarily in companies. And maybe 30 years from now, we're going to see another Anita Hill type or Me Too movement. And this is where, for me, being in the public sector and politics is so important. It's my life's mission to create and present laws that really have a lasting impact on our society.
This is another, for Tom. This is another question for Tom, because it is something that, you know, we've discussed, and I think that it really is a conundrum. So we have this heightened awareness, and now you have men who are in leadership and powerful positions who are very wary of taking their female junior colleagues on business trips, meeting with them for lunch, and all these sorts of things. But that's the way you get ahead. So I want to talk to Tom about that, because I don't think that the easy out here is, well, I just won't take her.
So what's the question?
The question is, how do you get around this conundrum that some men are expressing, that they are concerned about spending time with their junior female colleagues for fear that they will be accused of misbehavior?
I think it's a fake issue. I think you just continue to do the things that you do, and if that means going on a trip, I mean, you know, what we're trying to get to is being grown-ups and having mutual respect for each other. And that is not too much to expect. If we say, no, we don't think you can be on an airplane with another woman that's not your wife because, you know, that might look bad, that's really
that's not.
No, but I'm
yeah,
saying if
yeah.
the leader says, well, I don't think I can do that because it might look bad, I think that is that is an implicit giving in to the problem without trying to deal with it.
But I think we do have to be aware that many people in their private individual spaces are falling back on that as a way around the, you know, the fear. Really. I mean, I personally can talk about, as an instructor, being very careful about meeting with male or female students, or giving a hug, you know, if certain students I mentor or, you know, feel especially close to. I don't do that anymore. So I think it is a real issue that we have a chilling effect, and in the absence of a really public conversation about, number one, what is sexual harassment? I don't think we have consensus on that. I think we agree that there should be a zero tolerance policy, but we have not yet had a public conversation about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and why. So that's the first step. Because in the vacuum, people are going to default to, I'm just going to hang out around the water cooler with my male friends, and as soon as a woman walks up, we disperse. Or if I, you know, see a female student or a coworker that needs a ride, I'm not going to give the ride. And social networks are so important to how people advance in the workplace, and I think educational settings as well. So it's a real issue.
So what about this? If it seems like there are two ways two reasons that someone could take that position, that they're going to withdraw. One could be that they really are afraid that they'll be unjustly accused. And it seems to me the remedy for that is to take precaution to not unjustly accuse people. And so to not simply go on what one person says, but to investigate carefully and to have some rules for how those things are going to be done. The other is that it's just an excuse, and it's just kind of an overreaction, and I don't know how to kind of passive-aggressive response, and that I don't think we should tolerate.
I'd like to ask Tom one more question before we begin to take the questions from all of you. And again, I've got to tell you, as is always the case, the questions from the audience are just extraordinary, and we're going to work hard to get in as many as possible. But Tom, I have a question, because just until just a moment ago, we were talking a lot about mass culture, about entertainment and popular culture, about mass media, both traditional and social media. But I want to get back to something you talked about earlier, which is simply the day-to-day interactions in the workplace. Cinny had some fairly strong comments to make that I happen to agree with about the shortcomings of more traditional workplace training in these regards. As someone who works in this field, I'd be interested in your thoughts about better ways to address this. And I have to wonder, not to lead the witness, if any isolated training that takes place once a year or once every other year or once every 6 months, no matter how artfully it's done, has to be very limited in its impact. And I'm wondering in particular about what you can do before the formal training and after that makes those lessons more meaningful.
So it seems to me it's important to remember that the proportion of people who are perpetrators is relatively small. So it's maybe 5% or maybe 10% or somewhere in that vicinity. So training everybody is going to be boring to 90% of the people. And they're going to think, why am I in here learning that I'm not supposed to touch someone inappropriately or say something crude when I wouldn't do that ever. And I'm bored by being told that I'm not supposed to do that and having little caricature examples that just, the whole thing just seems ridiculous to me. So that isn't a good strategy. Seems to me a good strategy would be to make it easy for people and encourage people to report when those things happen, and then to have the people to whom the report is given trained and prepared for how is it that they respond to that information. How do they gather additional information? How do they counsel the person that has been accused? How is that whole thing handled in a way that is fair? One other thing that could be done that I don't think I have heard about being done, but I don't know why it wouldn't be a good idea. Most senior leaders, most leaders in general, including senior leaders, undergo something called a 360 about once a year, where the people around you are asked, well, what kind of a leader is this person? And there are a set of questions. It's anonymous, and that information is collected, and then the person gets feedback. It's a very nice mechanism for giving people information that might be awkward giving otherwise. Why not add some questions to the 360 of this kind? What kind of sensitivity does this leader show to this issue? You wouldn't have to say, do they behave inappropriately exactly, but you could ask questions that would highlight, or you could ask, do they behave inappropriately? I don't know. But you could get good information in that way, I think.
Cindy, I take it by your facial expression that you agree.
I want Tom to answer this question because I'm curious. So you're protecting a company worth X amount, hundreds of millions of dollars, $1 billion, okay? And you've got lawyers that are saying, I'm not taking that risk.
Yeah.
Everyone in this workplace is going to take that test, or everyone in this workplace is going to be educated, or everyone in this we are a nation of lawyers,
Right.
like it or not.
So
I love your approach, but as a person certainly in a CEO position or in a director position that's protecting a certain amount of money that is at risk from something like this, because inevitably that's what happens, right?
So seems to me one place where legislation could be really helpful is to address that very issue. And I don't know
I think that's where it gets hung up, right? I mean, that's really
Oh,
where it gets
absolutely.
hung up.
And that's the case with all sorts of organizational stuff.
Right.
Where legal comes in, the whole thing gets distorted, and then you have a whole new set of rules.
Yeah.
But you could deal with that legislatively. You could carve out a space for how this is to be handled.
We're going to ask the person who came the furthest to have the last word before we go to Q&A.
Oh, thank you.
Jet lagged.
Yeah, jet lag. I had a question too, and that is, so many companies now, it's standard practice for all the employees to have to sign non-disclosure agreements and arbitration clauses. So if there is any dispute, they have to go immediately to arbitration. If they leave the company, they can't say anything disparaging about the company. Do you think that that also contributes to the problem in that perhaps that creates a reluctance to report something that happened?
I do, but I don't think it's one-sided. In other words, the reason those clauses are in there is that companies have been burned by overly aggressive lawyers who will take any client that says anything and go after you unjustly. I can tell you as a person running a business, it happened to me, and you just have to shell out some money. And you know that you are innocent, and the lawyer knows you're innocent, and it's just a little game you play, and because it can be done, it's done. And it, for a small business, that can be a really damaging thing. I think the issue is, how do you get the legal system to do what it's supposed to do and not mess up organizational functioning? And I think that is possible, but it isn't the state that we're in right now.
Hey, one of the things we've gotten very good at over the last couple of years is not leaving nearly enough time for all the excellent questions that we get from the audience, and we'll apologize for not getting to as many of them as we'd like to in advance. So what we'll do is we're going to put each of these questions, or as many as possible, to one of the panelists, and then if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in afterwards, then of course they can. So Shakari, we're going to put the first one to you. We've spent a lot of time talking about these challenges as it relates to women in politics, to women in the entertainment industry, to women in the corporate suites. What about women facing these kind of challenges when their very livelihoods are at stake? Given the position on the socioeconomic ladder, that's a much less forgiving one for someone who puts a job at risk by confronting this type of behavior.
What's the question?
The question is, it's obviously a much more difficult challenge. How does someone from a less advantaged situation address it, given the stakes?
Yeah, I think, it's tough. We talked earlier at lunch about the two Ford Motor Company plants in Chicago, which was a case in which it's largely African-American women or women of color experiencing a culture of violence and harassment. And on both sides, women felt that they could not speak up because those were the only good paying jobs around. And likewise, the men who were the perpetrators, I think, were especially resentful of having women on the shop floor, because those were was a limited opportunity for good paying jobs, and that the women were messing it up for everyone. That's been going on for 30 years.
Well,
There have been
the messing it up for everyone means the messing it up for
men.
guys.
That's right. Because these are jobs that pay $70,000 a year, and they're often passed from father to son or uncle to nephew, etc. And I think Ford has had, and Tom can speak more to this, has said on paper that this is a problem. We have a zero tolerance policy, and there have been trainings, and nothing has changed. It has to do with, structural inequalities and power imbalances in this country, where blue-collar women and women of color are rarely believed or taken seriously. People are not willing to put their corporate and social capital on the line. And I think it's a cost-benefit analysis for many companies. They say, hey, we'll pay $10 million, which is what Ford has done with its settlements, because it's cheaper to do that than to close the plant. This plant is problematic. It will get closed. So let's just settle it quietly and hope that it goes away. I don't have an answer, but I think, I applaud the person who raised the issue, because it's very tough. And I don't know, Tom, if you can shed any light on that situation.
Well, I read the report. I thought it was shocking. I know Ford a bit, and I know people there, and I spoke to them about it, and they said, yeah, it's true. The report was not exaggerated. That is actually happening at that plant. So all I can say is the board of directors and the CEO are not doing their jobs.
And I would tell you, Shakari, if you want to applaud the person who asked that question, you and I will be applauding for quite some time, because a variation of that question came from a number of our audience members. Ted, a similar question came, not one specific to socioeconomic or ethnic status, but rather to the industry that you cover. And the questioner notes that for young people looking to get started in the entertainment industry, it's a very subjective business. And to some degree, that while a lot of talent is involved, physical appearance is a key component. And the people who make decisions, I'm obviously paraphrasing the question, directors, producers, stars, have a great deal of subjective authority. For a young, relatively powerless young woman or young man, the same question comes to you as came to Shakari. What kind of protections can be available to them, knowing that if they speak up, it could cost them a career dream?
That's a really great question. After the Me Too movement changed, will that change? In other words, will those hiring practices change? In other words, this whole idea of retaliation. If you say something, that fear, I guarantee you, is still very, very strong in the entertainment business. As many people who are coming forward, there are many others who are very hesitant, especially actors who are starting out, because you talk to many fledgling actors, they have gone for years waiting for their first break, and they don't want to have one little blemish on their record that will in any way jeopardize that chance, that opportunity. I don't know how you change it. I mean, part of the problem also is it's a freelance business. So I guess that there is an avenue to report. I guess when you go for a casting call, the casting director usually comes from a company, or there's a production company that could potentially be liable. I guess you would just hope that the movement, the Me Too movement, is strong enough to continue, and more people, it'll feed on itself. More people will be encouraged to come forward who won't have that same fear. It also reminds me, right after the Harvey Weinstein story broke, a CEO of a company called me, and he just said, I hope this changes not just the culture of sexual harassment in the entertainment industry. I hope this changes just the culture of the entertainment industry, because I have been on the phone with Weinstein and other CEOs, and you will not believe the stuff that will come out of their mouth. I will hear them talking to their assistants. And for those who don't know about entertainment, often that's the way you get in. If you're not an actor, you usually are an assistant, and that's how you kind of move up the rung. And the stuff that comes out of their mouth it's sociopathic. I mean, the way these people are treated. So that's another thing that I'm curious to know, whether it doesn't just change the culture of sexual harassment, but changes the culture.
Can I jump in really quickly? I know Anna has
yes.
Anna wants to say something, but just going back, I think what we've learned from the Harvey Weinstein case, you got to fire people. You have to have a zero tolerance policy, and it's someplace like Ford or other blue collar, what we might call downscale, companies. Sometimes you just have to clean shop and clear people out to be taken seriously.
And following up on that, I know we talked about how in the state legislatures now the members are personally liable for their behavior. How, in terms of the public or the policies of the board of directors of the major studios, the training and what the arbitration agreements are really meant to to protect the entire company, but wouldn't it be better for the board of directors to make it clear to the leadership in their company, you know what, you are personally liable. So not only are you going to get fired, but this is your lawsuit. You will pay out of your personal pocket. The company will not bear that liability.
And that actually was what was in Harvey Weinstein's contract back in 2015. He signed a contract saying you're going to be personally liable for any sexual harassment settlements that you make. The problem with that is that then exposed the entire board to this liability, because then the question came, well, at that time, what were you aware of that had already happened in the past?
So that's why it should be an across-the-board policy.
Guys, I'm sorry to jump in here, but we have a very large stack of excellent questions. Cinny, the next one I think should come to you. Is you talked earlier about the importance of increasing the number of female CEOs in C-suites. This question is a very, very direct one. Should there be quotas?
Well, I know it's been tried, certainly in other countries. Our friends over in Europe have tried this. Look, I mean, something has got to give. You know, this cannot go on. We need leadership. We need to create cultures in these workplaces. And I just wanted to take it a step further to say, I think the difference here also is it's a matter of economics. Look how fast NBC got rid of Matt Lauer. They were not willing to risk those morning ratings going down to cost them money with advertisers. And so he went out the door within, what, a week, 3 days, 24 hours? Look at what's happening in these industries, entertainment as well. You know, this is now hitting the pocketbook of these companies. And they're not willing to take these risks anymore. There wasn't a whole lot of money at stake with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. It was a public display in front of all of us on our televisions, but there really wasn't the bottom line of a company attached to this. And I think what is making this so different this time, getting rid of Kevin Spacey from this show, you know, is them not wanting the risk that this is ultimately going to hurt the bottom line of these companies in the end. And I think that the financial industry is next. Some of us woke up this morning to read about the suit filed against one of the hedge fund leaders in this country, both from an inclusion, but also to the degree of sexual harassment as well. These industries, it's hitting every sector now, but I'm afraid that I think the biggest impact of this go-around is really one that's economic. That Wall Street is saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't want my stock price to go down because of a boycott, and so I'm taking these high-profile people away from this situation before it really does major damage on the bottom line here.
And once again, as we had talked, as Tom pointed out before, for some people it's the right thing to do, for other people the smart
it's a
thing
money
to do.
decision.
Tom, let me ask a question to you.
Oh, about the quotas.
Yeah.
You know, do I think we absolutely must have them? I think we might pilot them in some cases, frankly, with some of these companies. It's clear we haven't made a whole lot of progress. Having said that, you know, when you're talking about the 26 CEOs that I referenced to you before, they really aren't heads of beauty companies. You know, one's head of PepsiCo, one's head of, you know, they're actually in Hershey's, I think, is one of the CEOs, Oracle. We've got some strong CEO positions in companies that aren't traditionally matriarchal type companies. So I guess that's been some progress, but I think it'd be something to pilot in
Just
this
real
country,
quick,
yeah.
even before that, pay equity. Making sure men and women get paid the same, because that encourages women to move up the corporate ladder, become CEOs. That would be, for me, the starting point.
Cindy, would you settle for financial incentives instead of quotas? So tax breaks, contingent tax breaks?
No, I don't think so.
So, Tom, let me ask if you can address this from another perspective. As we talked about earlier, and most of the people in this community know, you got very, very extensive experience as it relates to workplace and executive leadership development. What advice would you offer to aspiring female executives who want to achieve those positions in the C-suite? Certainly conversation to be had about legislative and legal and financial remedies. But from the standpoint of helping a really impressive young woman achieve that level of professional success, what advice, given your experience, do you give here? And we'll ask the female panelists, of course, to answer that question also, and Ted, from your observations as well.
So I think the opportunities are better than they have ever been. I think that companies are looking for women executives. It's if you're doing a search and a woman shows up who qualifies for the job, it's considered a find. I mean, there's enthusiasm for it. So it is now working in the right direction. So there is a lot going for women being promoted and getting into really good executive positions. So I guess my advice would be know that you have really good opportunities, and that means prepare yourself really well and do all of your homework and do all the right things, and you will have a shot.
And we're fortunate to have 3 panelists who've achieved that level of success as women in their respective industries, and an acclaimed journalist who certainly observed those type of successes, and a co-moderator who's achieved extraordinary professional successes as well. So for the rest of you, same question, advice particularly for the young people in the audience about how to achieve those kind of successes that you've been able to or have observed.
I have 2 quick ones. Negotiate the salary you deserve, similar to what a male executive would get, number 1. And number 2, understand about transformative leadership, which is what we teach in our academy. Transformative leadership and how to be a good leader. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. How to transform the workplace to to making sure that everyone's potential is brought forth so that the company benefits.
I think part of it is not only negotiating well, but asking for more than what you want. Because that's the key, right? But to know specifically to double what you want so that you will settle somewhere where you truly belong. Know your value. And part of that, I think, is, older women or more seasoned women connecting with younger women to mentor. Yeah. So younger women, find your mentors, women who have been there and can really coach you and answer the questions that you have in accelerating your career. That has been vital for me, and it's the things that people don't tell you. You're going to dinner. What do you wear? What do you order? What do you eat? That may sound a little nitpicky, but it's important. Those things make a difference, and it's something that you're not going to find in an employee handbook. So I would say mentorship, know your value and your worth, and always ask for more.
I don't really know what I can add to that. That was beautifully said. I think the most important thing is you need those mentors. And I think for many, many years in this great country of ours, men were really good at doing that with each other. And I think that we as women need to do that with each other. I think it's the only way we're going to make progress. I think I've had a lot of terrific male mentors. Don't get me wrong, I have. I've had strong, good, supportive male mentors, but I've also equally had female mentors, and I happen to have one of the most extraordinary female bosses in Wallace Annenberg right now at this point in my career and in this point in my life. I couldn't be more lucky to watch a pathfinder on her own, who was one of the first women who actually taught herself philanthropy and is celebrated as one of the best in the United States and across the world. So I really think modeling is really important. I think mentorship is really important. And, there's got to be a sisterhood in some ways in this country. There has to be. And I'm not sure, we've gotten there yet. There's still obstacles to that, and there's barriers to that. I think we have to get a little bit better to each other in the kind of sisterhood, so we can continue to move this forward. And that's not at the exclusion of males and mentors and having the male support in the workplace by any stretch of the imagination.
And that's our question for Ted is that you've covered a lot of very successful women in an industry that has very few women. Have there been any characteristics? Is there anything that you can take from some of those successful women that you could share with the young people in the audience?
Yeah, I think in terms of moving up the ranks, I think what I observe is don't take things too personally. You know, especially when you're in an industry where the problems are systemic, as the statistics actually bear itself out. I think it's don't take things too personally. And then, yeah, it's all about the way that they've handled setbacks. I mean, that's you know, continuing on. I mean, I hope it's not too much of a cliche, but
No, not at all.
I think that's the main
Not at all. Not at
main
all.
observation that I've had.
I was going to say, for my advice was just you have to believe that you can do it. You just have to believe it. You have to believe it. And you have to work hard, obviously. You have to be strategic. But you have to believe in yourself, because that, to me, is a quality which really just propels you forward. And enthusiasm, I think, is another thing that I've noticed. You know, be enthusiastic about whatever field you choose to be in. Make sure it's something that you really want to do, and you'll be good at it.
And it's worth noting, that's wonderful advice from our panelists for both young women and for young men who want to achieve their goals professionally and otherwise. We started a few minutes late, and so I've been instructed by Mr. Gilman that it's okay to run a few minutes late, and then because there have been a number of questions, an unusually large number of questions focused on a particular subtopic of this discussion. And the panel will ask you this. The question that came up over and over and over again from our audience in different ways is what can be done in our schools? What can we do either as training programs, as part of an existing curriculum, in terms of the socialization and guidance that we offer young people in other ways? In that K through 12 considerable window of opportunity, what can we be doing to prepare those young people for when they take the next steps to be better prepared for it than our generations have been?
Well, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is we have to begin to have more open discourse about sex and healthy relationships beyond sexual education. Young people are confronting issues in high school and on college campuses, and we as adults need to be able to talk to them about the real circumstances that they find themselves in. And it can't be a 1960s sex ed video. These have to be the real situations that young people find themselves in, be it with dating and alcohol and negotiations that go on. We have to have more intergenerational conversations. So it can't just be parents talking to their kids or teachers talking to their kids. We need forums like this that bring both young people and more seasoned people together to have mature conversation. So, seeing this room broadened and bringing more young people into this conversation, I think, is a vital part of that.
I was thrilled to learn that there is a Me Too K-12 movement as well, because if you look at Me Too, it's mostly adult women that we've heard from. And young girls, small girls have already experienced rape and incest and sexual violence in their home from their neighbor, from their uncles. And we haven't heard from them. And so I was happy to know that this is happening on our campuses. And going back to what Tom said, the leadership, those school boards, as elected officials, you should hold them accountable. You should ask, as voters, what are they doing to address this issue? Imagine if both men and women here today went to the school board, whenever your school board meeting is next, and asked that question. School board, what are you doing to help our young men and women in these times? So that would be my biggest recommendation, is action.
I think it's a really thorny and difficult problem, and I don't think I have an answer, but let me just lay out some considerations. So on the face of it, you would think this would be an ideal situation because you have them in there and you're teaching them stuff. Why not teach them this profound respect for each other across the sexes, within the sexes? But what we have done, especially in public schools, aimed at these kinds of sensitive issues like building self-esteem and sex education, has not been very good in its quality or very effective in its outcome. And in fact, it may have made things worse. By now you have political correctness, or now you have a formula, and the thing we're trying to get at is not formulaic. It's what is it about to have a deep respect for another person, whatever their sex, and it's the person, it's not that they're male or female. How do you do that? It seems to me you do that by demonstrating in the work that you do with the classroom, you demonstrate that respect and you require it of other students. So if students talk to each other in ways that are disrespectful, you don't allow that. But and so on. But I don't think we're yet ready to put it in the curriculum and call it something and teach kids that. I think we just probably make it worse.
Well, we'll let. Did anybody else want to add to this before?
I'll just add, my brother's a school teacher, and he always says it starts at home.
Yes, it starts at home. It starts at home, so on that note, we'll send you all home. In any event, we wanted to thank very much our wonderful panel. I think you will all agree that this was a really incredible afternoon. So again, I'll just go through Anna Cubas, Tom Krause, Shakari Byerly, Ted Johnson, Cinny Kennard. We also want to thank Andy Gilman. I think we have to actually put Andy in a band, and we can call it Andy Gilman and the Sound Machine. And then we would like to thank our volunteers. Thank you so much. I think you all... We thanked you behind your backs, too, when you guys were still out there volunteering. And then finally, we want to thank you, the audience. Thank you for taking the time to come and spend an afternoon with us and to listen, to give us your questions, and hopefully to go home and be able to talk about these issues with your networks, because I think that what we've learned today is that good people can affect good things, but you have to be willing to talk to other people about it, even when it's a very difficult subject. So with that, we thank you so very much. Good night.